Picture the Wild West, a dusty frontier town. A cowboy rides down the main street. He's wearing the hat, the boots, the gun belt. But there's something missing, a wristwatch. And that raises a strange question. Why didn't cowboys wear watches on their wrists? Today, wearing a watch on your wrist seems so natural that it's difficult to imagine anything else. But if you went back to the American frontier in the late 1800s, the watch you were most likely to find wasn't on someone's wrist. It was hidden inside their pocket, attached to a chain, and sometimes decorated with a heavy fob. The pocket watch wasn't just a way to tell time. It was one of the most important pieces of technology an ordinary American could carry. And the reason has a lot to do with how America itself was changing, because the real story isn't simply about cowboys. It's about how America learned to live by the clock. For most of the 19th century, the pocket watch was the standard personal timepiece. You didn't glance at your wrist, you reached into your vest or trouser pocket, then you opened the watch. And there was a good reason for this. A pocket watch was relatively well protected. It could sit safely inside clothing instead of being exposed to dust, rain, knocks, and whatever else a person might encounter during the day. And American watchmakers were getting very good at making them. Companies such as Waltham and Elgin helped transform watchmaking in America through industrial production. Waltham's history is especially interesting. During the American Civil War, demand for personal watches increased dramatically, particularly among soldiers. Waltham introduced relatively inexpensive watches to meet that demand. One of them, the William Ellery, became particularly popular among Union soldiers. By the end of the Civil War, it represented a huge portion of Waltham's sales. So pocket watches weren't rare toys for the wealthy. They were becoming increasingly accessible. And as America expanded westward, that mattered, because the frontier was becoming more connected. Towns were growing, businesses were expanding, and something else was rapidly spreading across the country. Railroads. Imagine America before the railroad. If you lived in a small town, the exact time wasn't necessarily critical. The sun told you when morning began. The church bell might tell you when it was time for something else. But railroads changed everything. A train couldn't simply leave whenever the conductor felt like it. Thousands of passengers and enormous amounts of freight were moving according to schedules. And there was a problem. Different communities could keep different local times. That might not matter much when you're walking across town, but when two trains are traveling on the same railroad, even a small error can become dangerous. Time had become infrastructure, and that meant the pocket watch suddenly had a much more serious job. It had to be accurate. Railroad companies began establishing increasingly strict requirements for the watches used by railroad workers. The ideal railroad watch wasn't simply pretty. It had to be reliable, legible, and accurate. And American manufacturers became extremely important suppliers of these precision pocket watches. Waltham, Elgin, and later companies such as Hamilton would become deeply associated with railroad-grade timekeeping. The pocket watch was no longer simply something you carried to know when dinner was. It was becoming an instrument of precision. But this creates an interesting question. If accurate time was becoming so important, why didn't people simply put the watch on their wrist? The wristwatch wasn't completely unknown in the 1800s. Wrist-worn watches existed, but for men they were not yet the normal everyday solution. And there were practical reasons. The pocket watch was already an established design. It was protected. It could be made relatively large. That meant a larger dial, a larger movement, and importantly, it was easy to wind and set while holding it in your hand. The pocket itself was also useful. Your clothing already provided a safe place to carry the watch. And there was another factor: fashion. For much of the 19th century, a man's pocket watch was considered completely normal. The chain itself could even become part of the outfit. You could see the chain running from the vest to the pocket. The watch was hidden. The chain was visible. It became part of the image of the well-dressed man. And that brings us back to the cowboy. because the cowboy's life was very different from that of a railroad clerk. He spent long periods outdoors, he rode horses, he worked cattle, he dealt with dust, weather, and physical work, so a fragile piece of technology hanging from the wrist wasn't necessarily an obvious improvement. Instead, the pocket watch remained the practical solution. But then something happened that would change the story forever. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but in the early 20th century, the wristwatch began finding a much more convincing purpose, and one of the biggest reasons was war. A soldier doesn't want to reach into his pocket when he needs to know the time. His hands might be occupied, he might be moving, he might need to coordinate with other soldiers. And during World War I, watches worn on the wrist became increasingly practical for military use. Pocket watches could be adapted, straps could be added, protective features could be developed. The basic idea was simple: put the time where you can see it immediately. This was a completely different requirement from the world of the cowboy. The cowboy didn't need to coordinate an artillery barrage. He didn't need to synchronize an attack. He didn't need to check a timetable while under fire. The wristwatch solved a problem that became increasingly important in the modern world, and after the war, its popularity continued to grow. The wristwatch went from being unusual to practical to fashionable, and eventually to normal. Now we can return to the original question: did cowboys wear pocket watches? Many people in 19th century America owned pocket watches, and they were widespread enough that the pocket watch became one of the defining personal technologies of the era. But we shouldn't turn that into another Hollywood myth. There wasn't a rule saying cowboys are forbidden from wearing wristwatches. The bigger issue is chronology. The classic image of the American cowboy belongs primarily to the second half of the 19th century, and the wristwatch had not yet become the universal men's accessory it would eventually become. So if you were an American living during the height of the Wild West, a pocket watch wasn't an outdated alternative to a wristwatch. It was the watch. That's an important distinction. We're looking at the past through modern eyes. Today, we see a pocket watch and think, why wouldn't you just wear it on your wrist? But to someone in 1880, the question might have sounded completely backwards. Why would you put your watch somewhere so exposed when you already have a perfectly good pocket? And there's another reason the pocket watch matters. The American pocket watch industry wasn't just producing accessories, it was developing the manufacturing techniques that would make American watchmaking incredibly powerful. Companies like Waltham helped pioneer industrialized watch production and interchangeable manufacturing methods. The result was something remarkable. A complicated mechanical device could be manufactured in enormous numbers, and that meant accurate personal timekeeping could spread through society. The pocket watch helped turn time into something portable, something personal, something increasingly standardized. And then the railroad pushed accuracy even further, the military pushed portability, and eventually the wristwatch combined the two. Accuracy from the pocket watch, accessibility from mass production, convenience from the wrist. The modern wristwatch wasn't created by one single invention. It was the result of decades of small changes. So perhaps the strangest thing about the cowboy and his pocket watch is that he wasn't missing the future. He was using the technology that made sense for his time. The pocket watch wasn't a primitive version of the wristwatch. For the 19th century, it was an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology. It could be beautifully finished, it could be remarkably accurate, it could be carried anywhere, and for people who depended on precise time, it could even become a critical tool. The wristwatch simply solved a different problem, and when society changed, the watch changed with it. The railroad made precise time more important. Industrial manufacturing made watches more affordable. War demonstrated the advantage of immediate access to time. And eventually, the wrist became the natural home for the watch. So, why didn't cowboys wear wristwatches? The simplest answer is also the most interesting. Because they didn't need to, not in the way we think of watches today. The pocket watch was already practical, already fashionable, already widely available, and already deeply integrated into American life. The wristwatch had to wait for the world to change, and when that world changed, the watch changed with it. From the pocket to the wrist, from the railroad to the battlefield, from a tool to an accessory, and eventually to something many of us wear every day without even thinking about it. So the next time you see an old photograph of a cowboy, look a little closer. You might not see a watch on his wrist, but that doesn't mean he didn't have one. It might just have been hiding in his pocket. And perhaps that's the real story of the Wild West watch. The cowboy didn't miss the wristwatch. The wristwatch simply hadn't arrived yet. Subscribe to Wisdom of Watches, where every watch has a story.